Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Skeen. I'm an environmental law fellow with NRDC's Canada project. Been working with the team for about 4.5 years now and been part of our big toilet paper campaign over the last couple of months that we're really excited to share with you. So what we wanted to talk about today is what's the big deal about toilet paper, why this campaign matters, some of the work that we've been doing, and how you, your organizations, and your members can make a big difference in this campaign and for the Boreal forest. So we don't usually think a lot about the environmental consequences of toilet paper, but as you'll hear today, it's really having a very dramatic impact on forests, wildlife, and the global climate. So why focus on tissue? Well, first, it's a huge market in the United States, valued at $31 billion. Americans consume more tissue per capita than any other country on the planet and are second only to China in terms of the total amount of toilet paper that they're consuming. So it's a really tremendously large source or purchaser of wood products. The other reason to focus on tissue is just how egregious the manufacturing and consumption of it are. It's a product that we use once and then throw away or flush down the toilet, never really thinking about where it comes from or the impact that it's having. Tissue is really the ultimate disposable product, making its sourcing especially troubling. And as we've learned, most Americans don't generally think about where their toilet paper is coming from. But our polling shows that if they did know, or when they are informed about the impact that it's having, they would demand change. And so our job is really to educate them about what is happening. And what's really happening is this tree to toilet pipeline. So trees are being cut down in the boreal forest and then turned into virgin tissue pulp and then created into tissue products and then basically flushed down the toilet or thrown away. So just to take a step back for a minute, why is Canada's boreal forest so important? Well, this is really for a variety of reasons. It's the world's largest intact forest, covering over 1 billion acres that span from the eastern provinces of Newfoundland and Labrador all the way over to the west in the Yukon Territory. And the Canadian Boreal accounts for 1/4 of the world's remaining intact forests. It's also home to over 600 Indigenous communities who have relied on the forest for millennia. It's home to really beloved biodiversity, like boreal caribou, pine marten, and it's the breeding ground and nesting ground of some of North America's most treasured songbirds. So every year, up to 3 billion migratory birds come up to the boreal to nest, and then in the fall, about 5 billion songbirds then fly south for the winter, going as far south as South America and even Antarctica. So the biodiversity that the boreal harbors really spans the entire Western Hemisphere. The Canadian Boreal is also the largest source of unfrozen freshwater on the planet, and it's also a globally important carbon storehouse. So forests, as the international community has really made clear, especially this past year, forests are really the forgotten solution to climate change. And if we're going to avoid exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, countries really need to protect our remaining primary and intact forests. And nowhere is this truer than the Canadian Boreal, which is the most carbon-rich forest on the planet, holding 2 to 3 times the carbon per acre as the Amazon, much of this actually in its soils rather than its vegetation. So the Canadian Boreal actually holds about enough carbon to equal about twice the total carbon in the world's accessible oil reserves. So it's a really incredibly vital ecosystem in the fight against climate change. So what's been happening is in Canada, there's been, each year over 1 million acres of boreal forest are harvested. So between 1996 and 2015, over 28 million acres of this forest were logged, which is an area about the size of Ohio. And this actually doesn't even include the forests in British Columbia, which are primarily non-boreal. And this is equivalent to 7 NHL hockey rink size areas every minute. And in recent years, Canada's actually had the 3rd largest intact forest loss in the world after only Russia and Brazil. And so you can see here a few pictures of what these clear cuts look like, really, devastating the landscape. And this logging is having some really devastating impacts for species, especially, boreal caribou. So boreal caribou are an indicator species, and they're iconic, they're integral to the ways of life of Indigenous communities. And the boreal caribou have been declining at a pretty precipitous rate. Only 14 of Canada's 51 boreal caribou herds are expected to survive long term, and they're declining at a rate of about 30% every 18 years. And because they're an indicator species, they're really a harbinger of problems more broadly in the boreal forest. So their declines are signaling that the forest is not doing well at all. And so a question we often get is, isn't Canada doing a good job of managing its forests? Well, a big problem is that Canada's main federal species protection law, which is called the Species at Risk Act, or SARA, is actually very weak when compared to the US Endangered Species Act. So as a result, boreal caribou range protection thresholds that the federal government called for nearly over 7 years ago have not been established. So provinces and industry are basically the ones that are determining what happens on what is called crown land or public land. In the process, Canada has really been pushing out pretty outrageous falsehoods about how logging in the boreal forest is a win-win, so good for the forest and good for the logging industry, even though the science is really showing otherwise. So impacts on boreal caribou, on the climate, and on Indigenous peoples. And some of the issues stem from the fact that the Canadian government claims things like zero deforestation is happening, which of course deforestation has a very narrow definition that really encompasses only the conversion of a forest from forest to something else, like a parking lot or a housing complex, and doesn't actually account for the amount that is being logged. And at the same time, this logging is having really tremendous climate impacts, and these emissions are not being adequately counted in Canada's national inventory reports that it submits to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change each year. So it's, at the same time that this logging is really emitting tremendous amounts of carbon, these aren't being accounted for and are really jeopardizing Canada's position as a climate leader. And there's also, in many communities, Indigenous communities across Canada have really only a portion of their intact forest left, and they are not sometimes adequately consulted, but certainly not given the opportunity to consent or not to the operations. So here's just a sad picture of a caribou, which of course is the same species as a reindeer. So as we get into the Christmas season, really highlighting the impact that our tissue sourcing is having on iconic species like Santa's reindeer. And as you can see here, degradation across Canada is only growing. It's gradually moving northward, more and more into intact forests, and we really have very limited time left to protect the intact forests of the boreal before they're gone. One issue is, or a common talking point is, won't the forest just regrow? These are trees. But what we've been really profiling is, degradation and logging is not something that is then remedied in really a human time span. Boreal forests grow slowly. It takes a long time for species to come back. There's really no observed instance of caribou populations returning en masse to previously logged areas. Impacts to the climate really take decades, about 60 plus years to recoup their carbon benefits. And we're actually increasingly learning that once a forest has been cut, there are actually areas of the forest that don't return at all. So, even though Canada is not counting this as forest conversion, they're not actually remaining forests. So our campaign is really focused on one of the major drivers of this destruction, which is US corporations. As I already mentioned, the tissue market in the US is valued at $31 billion a year. And some of the biggest players in this market are listed here. We have Procter Gamble, Kimberly-Clark, and Georgia-Pacific. And a lot of these companies use zero recycled pulp in their what they call at-home tissue products, so tissue products that are purchased for consumption in the household. So many of the brand names that people know and recognize, like Charmin, Quilted Northern, Bounty, and Puffs, use no recycled content at all, and actually up to a third of their pulp is coming directly from the boreal forest. So as I alluded to at the beginning, these products that we are consuming, usually without really thinking about them and then flushing down the toilet, is coming from this really invaluable forest that we are losing at a very rapid rate. But we also have companies like Marcal and Cascades that have been around for decades and have really been leaders in producing tissue products made from post-consumer recycled materials. So there's really a dichotomy in the industry between the laggards and the leaders. The laggards being those companies that are continuing to source entirely virgin forest fiber, and then we have leaders that are making their products entirely from recycled materials. So the point of this is, this is not a moonshot solution, something that we have no idea how to do. Using recycled content instead of virgin forest fiber really has enormous environmental benefits, and it's something that companies have already done, and we know a path forward. One of the most compelling reasons for transitioning to recycled material, in addition to helping alleviate pressure on species and indigenous communities, is the climate impact. So as you can see in this chart here, using recycled content actually has a third the carbon impact of virgin forest fiber. In February last year, we released our Issue with Tissue report. And what this report did was it basically ranked some of the leading tissue brands across toilet paper, paper towels, and facial tissue, and graded them based on a variety of criteria. And this report has really generated a lot of media attention. I think it really spoke to a lot of people who, of course, almost everybody uses toilet paper and interacts with it on a daily basis. And of course, a lot of people have no idea where it's coming from. So when presented with this information, it made a really big splash. And we plan to update this report in February on the anniversary of its release to update it with some changes and add some new brands. And as you can see here, Procter & Gamble's signature tissue products, so Charmin, Bounty, and Puffs, all got an F on our scorecard. And because of this, they have really been the target of our campaign. And also because they have a huge market share and have the power to make a real difference in the boreal forest. And just to give you a sense of the methodology that we used for this scorecard, we looked most heavily weighted was the total percentage of recycled material that each brand used. So, if it incorporated at least, 50 or 60% post-consumer recycled material, it was likely to get a B or an A. The lower amount of that material got it a lower score. But we also looked at things like the bleaching process that was used and whether or not the virgin forest fiber that they were sourcing is Forest Stewardship Council or FSC certified. since that is an indicator that at least where they are sourcing these materials, they are doing so more sustainably. So as I already mentioned, Procter & Gamble's products use no recycled content. And what's most alarming about P&G's actions is that they know exactly what's happening in their suppliers' tenures. Here's some of the actions that we've taken recently, including at their shareholder meeting this past October. So as you can see from this map, which we overlaid with caribou habitat, but which they supplied us the information about these tenures, you can see that in many parts of their suppliers' tenures, more than 35% of the tenure is disturbed, which means that logging has exceeded what Canada's federal caribou recovery strategy says is allowable if caribou are going to have even a 60% chance of survival. So, at the same time that Procter & Gamble is continuing to source its tissue products entirely from virgin forest fiber, it's also doing so in a way that is having really dire impacts on this very threatened species. So looking at the way forward, you joining onto this campaign will really push Procter & Gamble to change its sourcing and drive Canada to adopt policies that work for more than just industry. We're really at a turning point right now, especially with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, and pressure is building on Procter & Gamble, and this is a really key moment to get involved in this campaign and to continue to build that pressure at this really critical time. Work on this campaign will also help to support the work of our Indigenous partners in the Boreal forest and allowing, helping to facilitate their incredible leadership in some of the most exciting and successful conservation work that's happening in Canada. So for example, we are currently working at the invitation of the Cree in Quebec in support of their efforts to protect the Broadback River watershed near James Bay, which is one of the largest intact forests remaining in the Boreal, full of caribou. It's a massive carbon sink, and it's vitally important to the Cree. One of their past chiefs had this to say about the Broadback. Once these areas are gone, there will be no place left to show our children what the forest was once truly like when our elders thrived there. And so this is the story of an Indigenous community really fighting to save the last 10% of their traditional territory. And our campaign, getting Procter & Gamble to change its sourcing policies will directly impact the really incredible efforts of Indigenous peoples on the ground to protect some of their last intact homelands. So we really, really need your help. P&G and other tissue companies will really only pay attention to this if they feel pressure from their consumers and from the public. So some examples of things that you and your groups can do are to send letters and petitions, or so you could send your own or share an NRDC generated action alert. Right now, actually more than 265,000 people have signed petitions calling on Procter & Gamble to change its sourcing practices, and we'd really love to get to 300,000 by the end of the year. So if your group were to be able to send an action alert, we'd be able to collect more signatures and hopefully hit that number by end of 2019. We would love your help in recruiting other groups to join on to this campaign, sharing the importance of the Boreal forest and sharing how egregious current practices around toilet paper sourcing really is. This can include posting on social media, writing letters to the editor, especially in local newspapers that maybe haven't seen as much, haven't been exposed as much to our efforts so far. And really presenting on this issue to others and sharing what I've shared today about the Boreal's importance, both to Canadians and wildlife and globally. And of course, NRDC is happy to provide support and materials for your efforts. Always here on hand to answer any questions and to provide as much information as possible to make you participating in this campaign as seamless as possible. So there's so much you can do. And we're so happy you joined the webinar today. We really need help to get the word out about what's happening in the Boreal and with our toilet paper and other tissue products. And we need the Boreal, and that's not just because it's a beautiful place, but it's also because it's a critical piece in the climate puzzle. And as we all know, we have a limited amount of time left to take action to protect this really vital ecosystem. This is a campaign we can win. We've already seen the impact of our pressure, and we feel like in the long run we can win this campaign, and we can do that with your help. So thank you, and I will now answer any questions that you might have. So I think there's a Q&A at the bottom if you have any. I think you can type out your questions. Last call for questions. Oh, there's one. So one question is, isn't Canada a climate leader? I know you said they aren't doing enough. Yeah, so they certainly have a global reputation that they love to cultivate of being an environmental leader. And but what we're seeing happening on the ground is really much different. So as I already talked about, their species policies are really not protecting some of their most threatened and at-risk wildlife. So they have under the Species at Risk Act, the federal government has the authority to step in when provinces are not taking the actions that they need to protect species like the boreal caribou, which is what's been happening. They have not submitted those range plans. But unfortunately, the federal government has decided, or up till now, has not stepped in with any of these safety net orders that would protect this critical caribou habitat as it's being, from further degradation. So, and at the same time, Canada loves to call itself a climate leader, and basically, in certain senses they are. They've implemented a carbon tax, and they're starting to move in a better direction in terms of nature-based climate solutions. But in terms of addressing the impacts that their logging is having on the forest, they're far behind where they need to be. And this includes not really accounting for the emissions that are happening from this logging, and really burying in its national inventory reports the impacts of logging in terms of how they're actually addressing reducing its climate emissions. Okay, so one other question has been around limits in terms of available post-consumer sourcing, post-consumer recycled content, and what are the options for reduction of tissue consumption. So that's a really good question. So of course, our primary ask is for companies to transition to recycled materials, because these are what we found is this is the most environmentally friendly way to really source these tissue products. There are issues with supply, and there's some R&D that would need to be done in order to make this viable more broadly. But Procter Gamble is one of the largest companies globally, one of the richest companies, has billions of dollars dedicated to R&D. So what we're asking them to do is to be part of that solution and to help generate some of this infrastructure that will not only help transition tissue products to being more sustainable, but hopefully also make global and domestic recycling infrastructure more viable. And in terms of other alternatives, so yes, there are also alternative fibers. Some are more sustainable than others. So when we're, advocating for a transition to something like an alternative fiber, the devil is in the details. We very much would look to, whether that's certified, what kind of material it is it coming at the expense of other forests and clear cutting? But there are a lot of viable options like wheat straw, other ag residues that could be viable substitutes for this virgin forest fiber. Another question is, are the pulp mills supplying P&G sourcing sawmill residuals or whole logs or a mix? So our research in Ontario has shown that about 44% of all tissue pulp is made from roundwood or whole logs. So there is a degree, at least in Ontario, of entire trees going into the pulping process. And the argument that, oh, it's kind of just the scraps, these are just residual waste that's being used in these tissue products, is a really common one that we hear. But the tissue industry and tissue demand is on the rise, and this is really a key part of making these logging operations economically viable. So the fact that, and we've heard this from the companies themselves as well, the fact that even if it is, quote unquote, just the scraps for a majority of the pulp that's being sourced, this is continuing to drive the loss of intact forests. And really making this an industry that's worth pursuing, even unsustainably. So another question was, P&G is at least using FSC material. Wouldn't it make more sense to go after a company that's not using any sustainable material? So that's also a really good question. There are a couple of reasons why P&G has been our primary target. A big one is just the amount that it is sourcing from the Boreal. It's the largest at-home toilet paper producer in the United States, so it has a really outsized market impact. And we feel, because P&G really brands itself as an environmental leader, that makes its actions and the way it's sourcing its tissue products even more egregious. And in terms of the FSC sourcing, P&G does have certain commitments to FSC, but even with its kind of new ramped up commitments, it hasn't yet committed to ensuring that the way it's going to be sourcing these FSC materials is actually going to be sustainable in the long run. So there is a new FSC indicator that we're very excited about around Boreal caribou protection and around free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous peoples. But again, the devil's going to be in the details in terms of how this is implemented. And we feel we really need to push these companies like Procter Gamble to ensure that, where it is sourcing from the Boreal forest, it's doing so in a way that does comply with what the federal government and its scientists have said is necessary for caribou protection, and it is respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And right now, even in our ask to Procter Gamble, they have not committed to those standards, even though those are enshrined in the new FSC standard, which is very concerning. So, there's a really critical moment right now where this new FSC standard is happening, and we really need to make sure that we get that right. And then, of course, the other piece is, Procter & Gamble is sourcing, FSC, but it's continuing to source entirely virgin forest fiber, which, of course, with the dual biodiversity and climate crises that we're facing is really unacceptable, especially for a company that purports to be an environmental leader. So another question is, do you have an estimate of the percentage of fiber for tissue consumption in the US that comes from the Canadian Boreal versus domestic or other countries? So the U.S. More broadly is overwhelmingly the primary importer of boreal forest products. So it imports about 80% of all forest products from boreal provinces. In terms of the percentage of fiber for tissue, about half of all NBSK pulp or northern bleached softwood kraft pulp that is very much favored in these tissue products, about half of that does go to tissue. And in any given tissue product, about 30% of that is this NBSK pulp that is basically synonymous with the boreal. So, you can be very confident that a large proportion of any of these, Charmin, Bounty products are made up of large proportions of NBSK from the boreal. Any other questions? Last call. Well, again, thank you all so much for joining for the webinar today. We're really excited to see your interest in the campaign and would be more than happy to share any of this information with you. We'd also be happy to do this presentation again for your own networks and to continue to talk with you more about the work that we're doing and how you can be a part of it. So I think I had my colleague Shelley Vineyard's email up earlier. It's just svineyard@nrdc.org, or you can shoot me an email at jskeen@nrdc.org, and we'd be more than happy to follow up with you. So thank you again for joining, and please follow up with any questions.